Chapter 3. The Meaning of Knowledge. From among all epistemologists, St. Thomas alone speaks of a respect for the nature of the preeminent life that is knowledge. This attitude characterizes his system of epistemology, in which he reminds us that our knowledge of truth and its existence parallels our knowledge of the nature of the intellect. This respect for knowledge and its material, and the mind and its processes, provides the key to the pivot of his epistemological theory, and suggests a starting point for defining knowledge. This starting point is a simple one, clear in its lines. Knowledge is totally dependent on the object, and the object is totally independent of the knowledge the mind may possess of it. This means there is an intimate contact between subject and object, the object existing, awaiting the action of the intellective process, but while waiting, providing revelatory directives for the mind to use. It is the object which provides the opportunity for the mind to experience the beatific vision of what the object can come to mean in the mind. Knowledge is experience. It begins with and continues as the mind experiences the essence of an object. The object at first exists as the unknown, but at the point of the intimate contact, the fact of confrontation brings with it revelatory dimensions of the object's existence. With confrontation, the mind is awakened to the potential inherent in the object, and the search for understanding or meaning begins. To experience meaning is to actualize the object, ultimately making it an integral part of the subject itself. This is what makes knowledge an immanent activity. Knowledge, then, is an awareness of the object confronting the mind, and a consciousness of the meaning inherent in the object. Both subject and object are realities, in the same way modes and conclusions drawn in thought as ideas are real. It is a dialogue between the qualities of the mind and the qualities of all other existence which produces knowledge. It is the generation of ideas by the mind, by what it already possesses as essence, and the generation of ideas by the mind in relation to external objects, which provide the material upon which the mind works. Knowledge does not exist until the mind experiences its material, actualizing its object. To experience the material of knowledge is to perceive the dependency connectives between subject and object, and the operational consequence derived from the confrontation. Here, says Guzzi, is the union of knower and his object in an immanent act. But for the object known, while intentionally immanent, is existentially other than the knower. The mind of knowledge functions according to its presuppositions, and they are as follows. 1. Knowledge is knowledge of our self-consciousness. 2. The qualification of knowledge is by ideas. 3. To quantify knowledge is to develop concepts for the prime purpose of multiplying the objects inherent in the essence of the material of knowledge. 4. Thought without interpretation is a mind without knowledge. Knowledge is the thought of the knowable object, expressing itself by means of the revelatory powers of its intrinsic structure. Transcendental thought makes it possible for empirical truth to be experienced. Knowledge is the mode of thought developed by the intellective process as it experiences the essence of an object. Critical reflective thought is a means used by the mind in its need to possess knowledge. 5. While knowledge may be cognition of appearance, the actualization of essence makes depth of knowledge possible. To possess knowledge is to possess the ability to express the meaning of its essence. One means by which knowledge reveals its essence is by sense impression, a feedback to the mind. While knowledge is ultimate, its essence is analyzable. To possess knowledge is impossible for the mind unable to conceptualize. Knowledge is neither copy nor reproduction. Its essence produces the real. The basic component in the essence of knowledge is the proposition with its inference. To perceive knowledge is to conceptualize its material. To conceptualize knowledge is to perceive the structure of its essence. To possess knowledge is to know essence. To determine the essence of knowledge is to vitalize the process of revelatory construction. Knowledge combines the constructs of its essence to add to its dimension. 6. First principles serve as the source of all knowledge. 7. To experience meaning is to interiorize being, the nature of knowledge. Multiplicity in proposition is reduced to unity only when the mind experiences the totality of meaning. Knowledge, as the consciousness of meaning, is the presupposition intuited in all meaning. All meaning is contextual. This means that knowledge is the resultant of the cognitive experience of the mind actualizing its object. To discover meaning is to qualify the experiential value inherent in the object as the material of knowledge. Meaning is experienced when cause becomes means and effects are actualized in means. Knowledge without meaning is no longer knowledge. It is coextensive with experienced meaning. When knowledge becomes identical with essence, meaning is realized. 8. Knowledge begins with causal abstractions. 9. There is a cognitive intentionality inherent in the data of all knowledge. 10. Knowledge integrates and unifies the thinking of man with his confrontations. 11. Knowledge is the actualization of the real. It is the realization of the essence of the real. Knowledge reveals the presuppositions of reality. While all knowledge is real, its task is to disclose the nature of reality. The pattern of reality is knowledge expressed by means of the experience of the knower. Knowledge, the product of selective thought and the possession of the qualities of reality, is the perceptive experiential unfoldment of the real, the embodiment of an objectified reality. Reality is sensible in the same manner mind experiences meaning. 12. Knowledge is the actualization of experience. This is the starting point of the intellective process. Experience is neither past nor future. Within each proposition of knowledge lies the condition necessary for its existence, as well as the potentiality necessary for its actualization. Further experience serves as the check on the interpretive abilities of the mind. There is no knowledge independent of experience. Knowledge destroys the false conception that connectors exist between experiences. There is no between experiences. Knowledge is experience. Its essence is a fused one. Knowledge makes it possible for the mind to objectify experience in preparation for further experiences, and evolves from the mind experiencing the relationships among experience. Principles serve as the data of experience. 13. When the mind experiences its object, the antecedents of the object are realized as existentially knowable. When mind penetrates its object, it experiences by thought the nature of essence. Inherent within knowledge are the rules which govern and direct the mind in its discovery of essence. In knowing, the mind reasons its object and experiences its essence. Knowledge is the cognitive reaction of the mind to the confrontation encountered between subject and object. The mind conscious of its essence is a mind using its knowledge to interpret its data. Knowledge is non-existent as long as the mind is not conscious of its relationship to an object. Knowledge, as the content of the reflective power of the mind, is the transparency factor in the mind's ability to analyze and interpret its object. The mind guards against the relativity of perception by means of its cognitive sense. The mind knows itself by means of the knowledge which it possesses of its essence. Knowledge is the definition of the essence of the mind. 14. Depth in knowledge is qualitative. Knowledge is experienced when the mind employs, by means of the intellective process, the qualities of its essence. The quality of knowledge is found only in its power for conceptualization. Knowledge is knowledge of quality. As an existent, the concern of knowledge is with the essence of its qualities. 15. The knowledge contained in words is realizable when, as simples, they provide the incentive for reaction. All knowledge is expressed in words. This does not mean that knowledge is only for words. 16. While knowledge is fact, its certitude is the reality of its existence. 17. Knowledge presupposes a knowledge of knowledge. To possess knowledge is to possess an understanding of its assumption. 18. The knowledge of an idea is to possess a knowledge of the source of the idea. While ideas evolve from ideas, this does not presuppose a reduplication of knowledge. Knowledge implies an understanding of the essence of an idea in relation to another idea. To possess knowledge is to possess the ability to trace the history of an idea from its inception to its actualization. 19. Knowledge is never copy. It is the osmotic process of a complete identification. Verification of knowledge is dependent upon the nature of the historical present in experience. 21. To possess knowledge is to have interpreted the essence of its material. 22. As act of subject, knowledge as object becomes its subject. 23. To perceive an object is to possess a knowledge of its essence. Knowledge is gained when the knower identifies experientially with the object. All knowledge is historic in nature. The historical process is inherent in the intellective process, therefore within the nature of the object itself. Every object, as the material of knowledge, expresses its potentiality in the act of thought. The object of knowledge serves to fulfill the potential mind stance of the subject. Certain knowledge of an object is the realization that its essence cannot be doubted. Knowledge as what is experienced of an object is dependent upon the perceptive abilities of the mind. While object exists independently of the subject, such independence is necessary if the mind is to perceive it. It is the qualities of the object which become identical with the subject. 24. Knowledge of what is false has been so proven because of the empirical premises of the known. Knowledge is the structuring of premise and inference. 25. Methodology is the process chosen by the mind to perfect the knowledge of its essence. 26. The potentiality of knowledge is resident in its ability to predict the evolutionary perspective of its ideas. It is the applicative idea which proceeds from meaning. Knowledge results when cause becomes means and effects become the consequence of an object actualized for its potentiality. Knowledge is what is and changes its nature and meaning only when its potentiality is actualized. 27. Knowledge knows no boundaries. 28. The mind alone is able to unify the propositions of knowledge. 29. The language of knowledge is the verbalization of meaning. 30. The intellect functions in a state of becoming. When knowledge is possessed, the intellect moves from potentiality to actuality. 31. All knowledge is sensible. That means it has meaning for the mind, the sensate quality of being. 32. Truth ontologizes the being of knowledge in its revelatory powers. The truth of knowledge is identical to the being of its essence. Truth is realizable only as the mind actualizes the real and determines its potentiality by means of the material of knowledge. Possessed truth is certain meaning. 33. The being of knowledge is identical with the truth of its material. Knowledge is the realization of one's own being, the study of personal essence. It is the objective order in being which structures the object, making it identifiable by the intellective process, and subject to analysis as the essence of the reality of knowledge. All knowledge is dependent upon the ability of the mind to cognitively reflect upon the correlatives in the structure of being. The relation of knowledge to being is the relation of the parts to the whole. 34. Form is the stricture in the perceptive process of intellection on its movement toward the discovery of the potentiality of the material of knowledge. Form in knowledge is determined by the structure of its particulars and qualified by the nature of the universal. The forms of knowledge are the categories structured and devised by the relationship between subject and object. 35. The directive inherent in the cognitive act is dependent upon the nature of the ability of the mind to experience its object. 36. All knowledge possesses a cognitive order. determinant of the absolute value. 37. Knowledge is an absolute with relative values. 38. The intellective process synthesizes the conceptual power of the material of knowledge. Conjecture as to the potentiality of the material of knowledge is an integral part of the perspective of the intellective process. Characteristic of all material of knowledge is an intrinsic unity implied within the material of knowledge as the objective judgment. There is a logical structure to the material of knowledge, an order of quantified components in its essence. To analyze the material of knowledge is to depend upon the directives inherent in the source of the object of knowing. It is the data of the material of knowledge which is the essence of the mind. Knowledge is the reality of its material. 39. Knowledge is the resultant of communication, the reaction to propositions. 40. Knowledge arises from inquiry, the action of which constitutes its material. 41. All knowledge is ultimately reduced to belief. Without the belief inherent in faith, knowledge cannot exist. Belief is a resultant of the mind's ability to conceptualize truth. 42. Knowledge results when there has been the correlation of concepts to form a new concept. 43. All knowledge is founded on an inherent objectivity, the nature of which is based on the experiential qualities encountered in the process of conceptualization. 44. The principle of knowledge is governed by the mode of thought structured by the knower. 45. Responsibility inherent in the nature of knowledge is evidenced by its recognition of the dependency needs of particulars in relation to the universal. Inherent in knowledge is the universal. 46. The nature of knowledge is resident in the infallibility of its truth, and is characterized by its symbolical inferences. 47. All knowledge is assimilative in nature. 48. Knowledge is the resultant of a. The evolutionary intellective process, which has its own the identification of an object with subject. b. The mind's interpretive ability to experience the given. c. The reasoning powers of the intellective process. Knowledge is more than receptivity. It is the resultant of the mind's ability to experience its object. As a resultant, knowledge is the synthesis of experimental thought and the cognitive act. 49. Knowledge as the consciousness of the essence of existence and the embodiment of the idea of being is the essence of consciousness. Knowledge as the experience of meaning is dependent upon knowledge as the experience of consciousness. 50. Knowledge is the apprehension of a. The correlatives inherent in the relationship between existence and essence. b. The factual base of being. c. The essence of reality, the relationship which portends mere acquaintance, in turn portends low degrees in the apprehension of knowledge. 51. While knowledge is the appropriation of the given, it transcends the given as the mind objectifies its being. 52. The significance of knowledge is found in the interpretational qualities of the mind. 53. It is the intellective process which formulates structure and knowledge. The structure of knowledge is dependent upon its perceptive abilities in relation to the directives inherent in form. 54. Knowledge evolves when the mind experiences cause and the correlative system of meaning delineates the presupposition of first principle. To possess knowledge is to understand its cause. Its existence depends upon the experiential activity of the mind in relation to intentional sources. Knowledge is conditioned upon the ability of the mind to experience the presuppositions inherent in cause. 55. The function of knowledge is actualized only by reflective thought, the assumptive aim of reason. 56. Knowledge is a fact when the meaning of the object of knowing is experienced by the knower. 57. Knowledge is non-existent until the intellective process incorporates within its own being the perspective of relational logic. 58. To comprehend intuitively is to understand the objective judgment. The intuitive powers of knowledge reside in the intellective process. 59. Perception is the intellective organizer of the material of knowledge. 60. Existence is the presupposition of knowledge. It is the correlate of its essence and determines the condition of what is known. 61. Of utmost concern to knowledge is its responsibility to discern the nature of the change affecting the correlations among its working hypotheses. 62. The intellective process is without direction until the criterion of knowledge has been determined. The only criterion of knowledge acceptable to the mind is a logical statement. 63. The value of knowledge lies in its intrinsic potentiality, and in the fact that its essence is not an end into itself. Considering the implications of the assumptions listed above, it is evident that there are a number of problem areas in the science of epistemology which must be looked at. Since it is our basic contention that knowledge is the experience of meaning, and experience is the existential component of the human mind, to experience meaning is to possess certainty of what exists. The act of knowledge is existential in moment. This means that as an act is completed, it functions as an activity, and its essence is that of movement. The in-moment factor is when the mind assimilates its object. It is when the mind knows. This is the existential moment in epistemology. It is when mind attains by assimilation being. It is the moment when the mind experiences meaning, and the act of judgment has been completed. Actual knowledge is knowledge which has been experienced via its intended meaning. This means the mind has realized its existence as real, and the epistemological consciousness of the mind has functioned by means of the intellective process. The mind is unable to function from nothing or with nothing. There is movement only in confrontation, that is, in the relationship between subject and object. The same is true for knowledge. Popper tells us that knowledge cannot start from nothing, the tabula rasa, nor yet from observation. The advance of knowledge consists, he says, mainly in the modification of earlier knowledge. It is possible that alleged knowledge is merely unsubstantiated belief. To analyze knowledge is to experience the implicative values inherent in evidence. The implication itself is one of knowing being. To know being is to be aware of the potentialities resident in an epistemological perspective, and possesses the necessary determinants for the actualization of truth. What is the relationship of knowledge to reality? Is not the question in itself a paradox? Is it possible to make a distinction? In epistemology, is the proposition applied to reality? Again, a paradox. Rather, is this not the problem? What epistemological refinements make it possible for the intellective process to analytically deduce proposition from premises and concepts? And what determines validity for a given proposition? Polanyi does not hesitate to remind us that the conceptual framework of applicable knowledge is different from that of pure knowledge. Moreover, he says, it is determined primarily in terms of the successful performance to which such knowledge is relevant. The suitability of an object is an observable property, but it can be observed only within the framework defined by the performance it is supposed to serve. Is it possible for knowledge to exist which is logically prior to experience, that is, independent of experience? If so, what position does this place the mind in the cognitive act? If so, what type of definition does this force upon experience? What implications does it hold for universal principles, for empirical particulars? Perhaps it suggests that a priori knowledge is only analytical in nature. If this is true, would it not force empirical knowledge into the pale of mere probability? The data resident in the working hypothesis is suggesting a certainty. This is what serves as a premise upon which the cognitive act proceeds. It is the means chosen by the mind to articulate its knowledge. Knowledge does not exist unless it is assimilative in nature. The controlling factors here involve the ability of the mind for conceptualization and the empirical dimensions of the intellective process. Scheffler holds that the attributions of knowledge are not, in typical cases, simply descriptive of bodies of lore or types of experiences. They experience our standards, ideals, and tastes as to the scope and proper conduct of the cognitive act. They reflect, for example, conceptions of truth and evidence, estimates of the possibilities of secure belief, and our preferences among alternative strategies of investigation. To describe someone as knowing, he says, is as much to appraise and approve as it is to report. Correspondingly, education is concerned to transmit not only what we know, but our manner of knowing, that is, our approved standards of competence and performance in inquiry and in intellectual criticism. Authority for the validation of knowledge resides in cause as first principles. While reason is a methodology, its data justifies its aim existence as the material of knowledge. It is source which provides the authoritative criteria so necessary in the cognitive act. There is nothing uncertain about the boundaries of knowledge. There are none. Discovery prepares the mind for discovery. The intellective process demands constant movement and progression. In this sense, an idea makes it possible for another idea to be brought into being. There are no limits within these conditions. Cassirer addresses himself to this when he says that all the branches of knowledge presuppose a higher unity, where all meet and so are members of an organization that possess a concrete reality. It has often been suggested that knowledge by causes can be of two types, because there are two modes of causality, intrinsic and extrinsic. The intrinsic mode is subdivided into matter and form and material things considered in the abstract, and to potency and act when these same things are considered as being. The extrinsic mode is subdivided into efficiency and finality. Knowledge that grasps reality in its intrinsic causes is knowledge by apprehension, whereas the grasp of extrinsic causes depends upon reasoning, a complex act whose object includes the complexity of relations between cause and effect. Regis. To say that things are intelligible is to imply they possess the potentiality for meaningfulness. To ensure intelligibility as well as meaningfulness calls for an understanding of cause as first principle of knowledge. Cause is an active agent in the intellective process. It is the source of the operational perspective of the cognitive act. We raise two questions. 1. How does the mind inquire into the premise upon which certitude rests? And 2. What happens to the mind when it possesses certain knowledge? Certainty as a concept always confronts us with the question of doubt. The master of this problem is Descartes. He makes every attempt to establish certainty in knowledge by means of the reflexive method. One can doubt the existence of the external world and even of his own body, he says. They may be objects of an illusion or of a dream, or appearances produced by an evil spirit. But one cannot doubt that he doubts, and therefore that he thinks, without contradiction. The proposition "I think" is supposed to be undeniable on principle, since it is apparently presupposed through its denial. It may be observed that the Cartesian argument presupposes the validity of memory, so it cannot lay claim to absolute certainty. One can always doubt that he doubted. If it is not possible to doubt that one is doubting at a given moment, as a matter of psychological fact, it is also true that it is not possible to affirm the doubting process at the same time. Once the doubting experience is over, it is possible to doubt that it ever happened. Farber. Our questions raised above, as well as those which confront us in Descartes' proposition, will require our attention at every point in our analysis of epistemological theory. If we are to believe Plato, the implication of his positions are far-reaching for even the most highly structured idealist. Human knowledge, he says, has an immaterial character. The object of this knowledge is outer reality. This, too, must be immaterial. What, then, makes reality real? Of what is the essence of the material of knowledge? What is the starting point of complete knowledge? Aristotle says, omnis cognito nostra a sensu insipid. Not at all. Complete knowledge does not start from sensory perception, and sensory perception does not cause the first awakening of consciousness. We cannot perceive without benefit of a highly developed sense of consciousness. And is this what Aristotle really meant? What determines our conception of knowledge? Without question, what we know is in relation to what is already known, and how we know is in relation to the learning model already structured by the mind. The mind functions experientially. This means with what it has to work. It functions upon and through its essence. Ideas comprise the sum of essence. The quality of the idea in relation to quality in other areas provides the interaction underlying the intellective process. It is this activity which provides the hypothesis inherent in every intellectual act with a conception of meaning. To conceive meaning is to experience knowledge. Both factors are necessary in our determinative process, which alone culminates in a conception of knowledge. To determine a conception of knowledge is to experience an intellectual act. With the attainment of the conceptual knowledge, the mind is enabled to conceptualize. A paradox? No. It is a matter of determining relationships. For knowledge to be attained, the mind finds meaning in its object. For instance, meaning is found in matter. Thus, there is a relationship to matter. To find meaning implies the mind possesses its object, and to do this, it has to transcend mere representation and conceptualize being. Conceptual knowledge means the mind understands the relation of meaning to its object. True, it is a matter of abstraction, but then, this characteristic of all process of conceptualization. It is conceptual knowledge which makes of all reality common. The primary condition for knowledge is consciousness. This means in order to learn, the mind must be able to experience meaning conscious of intention, as well as implications of the object. Mind is the only reality which can experience meaning in what exists. While knowledge is what is possessed by the mind, its original existence was independent of the mind. Essence exists outside the mind until experience brings it within the mind via the meaning it portends. The content of knowledge is experienced reality. There can be no knowledge without its content. We cannot determine criteria until we have answered the question, what is the nature of reality? This requires the mind to metaphysically conceptualize the essence of the real. All this is quite contrary to Dewey's thinking. He would have us believe the criterion of knowledge lies in the method used to secure consequence. This is true in part. It also lies in metaphysical conception of the nature of the real. This does not place all emphasis on subject or in the Aristotelian stance, believe that the subject exercises a function in the act of knowledge, which is exclusively proper to itself. Here we do not agree with his use of the word exclusively. Finality has a goal, and for knowledge the relationship between subject and object is the content of the experience. The intention of the real expresses itself in the meaning which has been understood. What are the problem areas in an attempt to answer the question, what is knowledge? And we will raise them as questions. 1. What makes it possible to define knowledge in a way in which the definition serves as a vision of unity? 2. What is the inner dynamism of the knowing subject? Is it knowledge? 3. What is the being of knowledge? 4. Is the search for knowledge the search for essence? 5. How does definition express essence? 6. What is the relationship between the knower and reality? 7. Is reality the material of knowledge? 8. What are the characteristics of the material of knowledge? 9. Is truth existential property of knowledge? 10. In what ways does knowledge confront reflection? 11. Is the substance of knowledge absolute, and does it possess cause? 12. What is the efficient principle of knowledge? 13. Is cause and source of knowledge to be considered identical? 14. The nature of knowledge, does it refer only to the human mind? 15. What are the objects which characterize knowledge? Reviewing the above questions in a sense forces us to consider at first response the implications of discursive knowledge. It is Dewey who provides us with thought setting on the subject. Discursive knowledge, that which involved reflection, he says, must always be referred for its validation back to what is immediately known. It cannot bring its credentials with it and test its results in the very process of reaching them. There is postulated identity implicit or explicit of the results of inference with things known without inference. Making the identity explicit constitutes proof. This raises yet another question. Is it possible for duality of knowledge to exist? Is the theory of knowledge predicated on these assumptions? 1. Consciousness makes it possible for knowledge to be possessed, and 2. To conceptualize is to experience meaning. Thought is the working base of all experience. Experience is the embodiment of consciousness. To delineate problem areas in empirical knowledge, it is necessary to look at its premise, these number 13. 1. Empirical knowledge affirms pure perceptive propositions. Russell. 2. Empirical knowledge requires premises asserting matters of fact. From Russell. 3. Empirical knowledge defines basic proposition as those of its logically indemonstrable proposition, which are themselves empirical, that is, assert some temporal occurrence. Russell. 4. Empirical knowledge consists of indirections from a number of more or less similar experiences. Russell. 5. Empirical knowledge insists there is always an empirical factor in knowledge, even the knowledge of the a priori. Weigel and Madden. 6. Empirical knowledge expresses its perfect form through the categories in the judgment, where the object indicated receives its meaning in the predicate of judicial affirmation. Weigel and Madden. 7. Empirical knowledge gives an existence of otherness, except through empirical knowledge. The mind cannot know the otherly existence. Consciousness cannot give it. Weigel and Madden. 8. Empirical knowledge by categories is essentially different from consciousness, which is pure awareness without categories. Both may be called empirical because they entail experience, but they are different in their reaction to the experimented. Both are intellectual, but in empirical knowledge a process is entailed which must include the material aspects of man. A pure spirit could not achieve knowledge by empirical discovery. Weigel and Madden. 9. Empirical knowledge eventually goes back to knowledge of empirical particulars. Generalizations have their ground in the coincidence of such particulars. Knowledge of the particular functions also as the basis of the applicability of general principles, which are not empirical, but a priori. Knowledge of the particular is rooted in immediate experience. Lewis. 10. Empirical knowledge is exclusively a knowledge of probabilities. The validity of it in general depends upon the validity of induction and probability judgment. Lewis. 11. Empirical knowledge contrasts itself with judgment of pure reason, the axioms, principles, and categories of reason. Watkin. 12. Empirical knowledge recognizes the principle of causality. Cassier. 13. Empirical knowledge is based on a logical doctrine concerning the distinction between analytical propositions, synthetic propositions, and metaphysical verbiage. Ayer. Marathon speaks of empirometric knowledge as that knowledge which evolves its concept not in being, but exclusively in the measurable, in which man perceives that everything in the physical world cannot be strictly measured. The essence of knowledge we are equating with the material of knowledge, yet this position may confuse the epistemologically oriented mind, unless we think of essence in the same vein as Kant, that is, the essence of knowledge as synthesis. Synthesis bespeaks a totality, either as an existent, purely in the realm of the potential. Even this stance does not force us to say that the essence of knowledge lies primarily in intuition. It may only, however, if we allow the intuition to be directed by the cognitive process. Intuition is much more than Kant could have us believe when he says, intuition takes place only insofar as the object is given to us. It is the responsibility of existential knowledge to raise questions about its own being. This it does by means of methodological inquiry, using the value judgment to form its belief about means. Its concern is with the will, the source of motivation for the intellect. The will serves as the dominant principle as well as the source of epistemological energy as the mind moves, by degrees, on the scale of apprehension toward the experiencing of meaning. The existence of knowledge is the ability of the mind to interiorize its essence or material. In what way can we raise questions about knowledge unless we understand the implicative values inherent in the fact of knowledge? Does this force us to begin with knowledge as a given? To do so would insist we think of the intellective process as the embodiment of a knowledge in order to experience knowledge. Our question, then, is knowledge a given? What implications are there in the foregoing question which might lead us to agree with Carnap that to gain factual knowledge a non-logical procedure is always necessary? Would not such a position force us to ask, what are the criteria for factual knowledge? Blackstone seems to feel he has the answer. Factual knowledge, he says, is always informative about the world. K includes descriptions and explanations of the phenomena of nature. It is inferential and testable. However, the testing procedures can at best render factual inference highly probable, but never completely certain. Even if the present available evidence completely support a given factual belief, there is always a possibility that some important data have overlooked, and the further possibility that future experience will provide confirming data. Guzzi approaches the problem by saying that factual knowledge is heavily sensory. Of course it is. All knowledge is sensory. It is the only operant setting from which the mind can function. Even the most abstract idea possesses a sensory base. Guzzi continues, the intellect, he would have us to believe, though we do not, does little more than assent to the truth of the fact represented, or questionable word, in phantasms. This is not to say that factual knowledge is unimportant, though the intellectual content of an act of assent to concrete facts is minimal. Factual knowledge supplies the foundation for any higher type of cognition. It is here, he says, that the mind gradually builds up a store of phantasms which will be instruments for future intellectual knowledge. We may say, then, that Steenbergen is correct in his assumption that the finality of knowledge is the datum of consciousness as well as a fact. The central point in the functional view of knowledge, Cassirer says, is in the relation of thought to object. Since we are inferring problems and areas for further thought, we take the liberty of exchanging the proposition of Cassirer for questions. When is the object to be treated as a given fact as well as a problem? When does the object serve as the goal of knowledge and not as its starting point? What constitutes the realm of its own operation? Is knowledge built up by stages? As the process advances, does the object become more and more sharply designated? Do we progress from general to the particular, abstract to concrete determination, and then try to show how the latter presupposes the former and are based upon them? Steenbergen responds, growth in knowledge, he says, is an essential element in the development of man's personality as well as, on the level of society, of human civilization. The educated man strives not only to extend his store of knowledge, but also to organize and evaluate the data of popular knowledge. It is this effort which gives rise to scientific life. In his desire for knowledge, man thus seeks an ideal of unity, incapable of a unique intuitive act that would satisfy his whole appetite for knowledge. He admits that human knowledge can arrive at unity only through the unity of a synthesis. There is an ordered wholeness in all existence. The mind, as an existent and as the knowing power, strives to identify with this ordered wholeness, thereby actualizing its material. Is this the sum and substance, then, of the cognitive act? Dewey locates our problem for us. He says that it has often been assumed that higher education must be supplied by pure thought. Now it is taken for granted that thought, while indispensable to knowledge of natural existence, can never in itself provide knowledge. Observation is indispensable both to provide authentic materials to work upon and to test and verify the conclusion reached by theoretical consideration. A specific kind of experience is indispensable to science instead of all experience setting a limit to the possibility of true science. The problem is whether or not observation has the ability to provide what Dewey demands. Perhaps it is to perception we must turn to meet these requirements. Moreover, there appears to be a problem of historicity involved. If we agree with Mannheim that all historical knowledge is relational knowledge, then we are faced with the task of discriminating between what is true and what is false in such knowledge. We raise only one question here, the product of thought. Is this the only means of our disposal for identifying knowledge? Ideal knowledge exists when the mind as a subject experiences the object. In such experience, the object as the material of knowledge is fused in the subject. We are interested, of course, in the problem of epistemological fusion. It is identical with the cognitive act. Scheffler structures our question, what about the present fact itself? Rejecting infallible knowledge of causal connection, some have affirmed, while others have denied, that a special sort of certainty attaches to a mere empirical description. Recall that the main brunt of Hume's argument was directed against the notion that causal relationships can be ascertained through a priori reasoning. He addressed particular attention to the connection between the present fact and that which is inferred from it, arguing that nothing so inferred can be guaranteed true in advance. This is not our only problem, however. It is ontological knowledge and its many implications which confront us with a number of other problems, the nature of which bespeak a depth not encountered in other areas. As an example, Heidegger says, without any hesitation, that ontological knowledge turns out to be the problem of the essence of synthetic judgment a priori. This would mean that ontological knowledge, in the words of Heidegger, is judgment according to principles which must be brought forth without recourse to experience. Would this not require a provisional characterization of that knowledge? What does this say to our epistemological stance? The domain of the revelation of the origin of ontological knowledge is none other than that of the human mind. While our total study in epistemology does not in any way emphasize the theories of Heidegger, at this point we permit him to raise additional questions, which will be answered in another context. Does the essential unity of ontological knowledge always provide a basis for the determination of the essence of categories? Is it possible to speak of an ontological knowledge if it attains truth? Does ontological knowledge always form transcendence? If so, does formation hold open the horizon within which the being of an essence is perceptible in advance? Does not ontological knowledge, the essential ground on which is supposedly the transcendental imagination, have, as essentially finite, an untruth corresponding to its truth? Is the only reason why ontological knowledge is made up of transcendental determination of time because transcendence is temporalized in primordial time? Putting all this together, is not our real question whether or not ontological knowledge proffers the setting in which the mind finds satisfactory answers to the questions addressed to by the cognitive act? Weigel and Madden raise an interesting point in discussing the phenomenologist and the direction in Kant, whether or not he is true to the phenomena of knowledge in supposing that the concept derives from the structural dynamism of knowledge. Is not the class notion content and not merely form? Windelband tells us we must start from the fundamental fact which underlies all logical reflections, namely making a distinction from the point of view of value between the true and the false. Without question, he would have us believe that the phenomenology of knowledge is the sum total of the empirical phenomena of knowledge, which constitute the given presupposition of logic as theoretical philosophy. The question of the possibility of knowledge a priori is not the problem. How can we know in advance that experience, which should not conform to our principle, will not be veridical, or will not be real in the category which is in question, asks Lewis. The former question can have no answer unless by some impossible dogmatism about the limitation of experience by a mind which is itself above or beyond experience, and henceforth unknowable. And even this hypothesis of transcendent mind does not assure the permanence of its condition, unless by some further dogmatism which assumes its continuity unchanged, Lewis adds. Are the only preconditions of knowledge those suggested by Kant, namely space and time? Did he not only consider these a priori preconditions of knowledge, but also for perception? End of chapter.